Got my property flagged for public use the same week I turned 68 and buried my dad's old fence post hat under the first orange stake. Name's George Whitaker, retired civil engineer. Could still smell cedar and rust from my shed when the SUV tires rolled in. That red notebook. Still in my coat pocket. What do you do when community spirit trespasses in silence? George Whitaker stood by the edge of his porch, coffee steaming in hand eyes on the farm road that curved like a scar across the land his father once plowed. The mug warmed his palms through the morning chill, and the mist hadn't yet lifted from the pecan trees near the creek bed. The sky over Brindle Hollow glowed a pale honey color, quiet and slow, like the town itself. From somewhere far down the road a mourning dove called once then was silent. His father's words echoed faintly. This road carried more than crops. Georgie, it carried our name. George sipped and stared a little longer until the warmth in the cup gave way to a slight chill. He returned inside, set the mug on a cork coaster by the kitchen sink, and laced up his boots. The gravel crunched beneath his steps as he walked toward the road. A small overnight rain had left its mark thin trails where runoff carved through the dust. He moved along the shoulder, checking for soft spots, places where the packed earth gave way too easily. The wind brought the smell of cedar and earth. He noticed something then, tire tracks fresh and unfamiliar. Too wide for Franklin's truck, too deep to be from Edith's hybrid. These had patterning he didn't recognize. The angle suggested someone had come from the west and turned around in his hay loop. He crouched, pressing 2 fingers to the indentation. Damp. Couldn't be more than a few hours old. At Witt's Diner, the booths were still mostly empty. George settled into his usual seat under the window where the sunlight hit the formica table just right. Shirley, the waitress with the white blonde beehive, refilled his coffee without asking. He left 2 folded dollar bills under the salt shaker as always. Franklin showed up 10 minutes later holding a folded newspaper and grinning like he knew something worth sharing. "You see him?" Franklin asked as he slid into the booth. "See who?" George folded his napkin neatly. "Those Maynard gals, Cheryl and Diane. They were poking around your south fence line yesterday. I was hauling brush, saw 'em from the ridge." George raised an eyebrow, but his voice stayed even. "Did they come up to the house?" "Nope. Stayed on the road, looked around. Took pictures, I think, then left." George took a slow sip. "Huh." Franklin glanced toward the counter and lowered his voice. "Heard they're real cozy with the Historical Development Council now, pushing something about tourism routes." George gave a small nod but didn't speak. Instead, he pulled a creased envelope from his coat pocket. "HDC sent me this. Got it yesterday." Franklin leaned in as George slid the letter across the table. It was printed on thick stock with a gold seal in the corner. "We believe your historic property may qualify for integration into the Harvest Heritage Trail." It began and it ended with a suggestion to schedule a visit to explore shared cultural opportunities. "Sounds like a land grab wrapped in ribbon," Franklin said. "I filed it where it belongs." George tapped his chest pocket, then patted the left side of his coat for emphasis. "Under suspicious correspondence." They shared a small laugh before turning their attention back to the biscuits and eggs. Later that afternoon, George stepped back outside with a small wooden box in hand, his tools. He moved toward the southern edge where the barbed wire fence bowed slightly between old cedar posts. His boots found their way instinctively. The path was one he'd walked since boyhood. A flash of orange caught his eye. Near the furthest post, driven into the earth at an angle, was a plastic stake. Bright synthetic and out of place. George moved toward it, kneeling with a grunt. The stake bore stenciled letters HDC AU Tutun 1, partially worn but legible. He stared at it for a long moment before reaching into his pocket and pulling out a small spiral notebook. Flipping to the latest page, he wrote a quick line, 10:17. Orange marker, south fence. HDC ID. He tugged the stake free with one slow pull. The ground made a soft, reluctant noise as it came loose. He pulled out the stake slowly and mutters, "Not today," before taking it inside and logging the time in a small notebook. "Don't worry, Mr. Whitaker," Cheryl Maynard said, smiling like a realtor selling oceanfront in Kansas. "It's just a beautification effort." The meeting hall smelled faintly of cinnamon and floor wax. Folding chairs scraped against linoleum as neighbors settled in, cradling styrofoam cups of spiced cider. At the front, a projector buzzed softly, the screen still blue. Plastic pumpkins lined the windowsills, each grinning under the flickering fluorescent lights. On the side wall, the community bulletin board overflowed with curling flyers, lost dogs, pie fundraisers, a veterans brunch 2 Saturdays from now. George took a seat near the back, nodding at Franklin, who tipped his cap without speaking. He preferred distance in these meetings, easier to observe, harder to be noticed. He scanned the room. Diane Maynard was adjusting a fall-themed scarf over her blouse, murmuring something to her sister. Cheryl stood nearby, already rehearsing her opening lines in a barely audible hum. Everything about her posture said presentation mode. She wore a bright orange jacket with gold buttons and held a clicker like it were a baton. Diane, softer in both tone and presence, remained 2 steps behind her as always. A memory tugged at George, a town council session years back when Cheryl had pushed to repaint the old post office because, in her words, it was aesthetically stagnant. It hadn't gone through, but only because 3 veterans had stood up and objected. Cheryl had sulked for weeks, according to the gossip at Witt's Diner. Now she stood tall and beaming. "Good evening, neighbors," she began, her voice amplified by the portable mic clipped to her collar. "I'm so excited to share our vision for the Harvest Heritage Trail, a celebration of our town's rustic charm and seasonal pride." Diane clicked through the slides as Cheryl narrated. Pictures of hay bales. Fairy lights and painted wooden signs lit up the screen. "We'll install lantern posts here," Cheryl said, pointing to the map and a selfie station there themed like an old-timey wagon. Some folks chuckled politely. One teenage girl rolled her eyes and took a sip of cider. Cheryl continued. "Thanks to our beautification reserves, none of this affects your property taxes. It's all about giving Brindle Hollow the shine it deserves." George tilted forward. Something on the map snagged his attention, a bold green arrow slicing through the southern bend of his property. It was labeled Access Corridor in curly script. He raised his hand calmly. "Were private landowners contacted about the trail segments?" Cheryl's smile didn't falter. "We sent letters," she said brightly. "Some may have missed them, but we made every effort." Diane nodded, not looking up. A murmur passed through the room. Edith Stone, sitting near the punch bowl, suddenly found great interest in her notepad. George watched her thumb the pages, fidgeting. Edith had always been cautious, too cautious to cross Cheryl, but too honest to hide well. When the meeting adjourned, chairs scraping and cider cups tossed, Edith approached him quietly near the exit. "George," she said. Voice low. "You should check the new zoning map." He frowned. "Why, I didn't approve that overlay," she whispered. It wasn't in the last board packet I signed off on." George said nothing. He gave a slight nod, then turned to leave. Outside, the air had cooled and his breath came in faint white wisps. He drove home with the radio off. Back at his kitchen table, the county GIS website took its time to load. George tapped his fingers beside the mouse eyes, narrowing as the layers built on screen. There, plain as day, was the new designation, a shaded path marked Shared Access Buffer, winding along his fence line and spilling over part of the east field. He clicked the last modified tab. Timestamp, 3 days ago. He grabbed his notebook, jotted the date, circled it twice, then picked up the phone. After 2 rings, a young-sounding clerk answered. "County Land Office. This is Megan." "Yes," George said, keeping his tone even. "I'm calling about an overlay that's appeared on parcel 118B. There was a pause. Some typing, the sound of keys muffled through a headset mic. "Oh," she said after a moment. "That overlay, that came from an HDC request. It's pending final approval. By morning, the road bore new wounds, 6 bright orange stakes driven in like exclamation marks. They punctured the earth in straight lines that didn't belong, their plastic caps catching the morning light like warning beacons." The overnight rain had softened the soil just enough for them to sink deep, standing smug and upright along the bend where the gravel thinned near the drainage ditch. George stood silently, a thermos of black coffee warming his left hand. His right held the same steel tape measure he'd used since 1974. He pulled the line taut, eyeing each stake's distance from the center of the road, noting the deviation from previous fence markers. It wasn't random. Someone had measured, guessed, or imposed a grid that didn't fit. He remembered his father's gravel-thick voice as they built the back fence decades ago. Measure twice, dig once, and never on someone else's dirt. A truck pulled up, tires crunching against the wet gravel. Franklin leaned out of the window holding a brown paper sack. "Peace offering," he said. "Muffins. Edith sent 'em." George took the bag with a nod. "You see this mess Franklin got out and walked the bend. 3 just near the creek, and those are barely holding. 1 good flood, and they'll wash into the culvert. Help me pull them gladly." They worked in quiet rhythm, Franklin bracing each stake with the heel of his boot while George gripped and twisted them free. Each made a sucking noise as it emerged from the damp earth. George carried them to his shed, careful not to scuff the stenciled letters HDC AU20, HDC AU22, and one newer, AU23, Sage Buffer. The shed was cool, steeped in the smell of cedar shavings and motor oil. Dust motes hovered like memory. George set the stakes along the wall, then lifted the wildlife camera from its shelf. He checked the battery light green. He inserted a fresh SD card and checked the lens for smudges. Satisfied, he grabbed the clipboard marked Trail Log and flipped to a clean page. October 21st. He wrote, 3 unauthorized markers removed. Photos taken. Will log footage nightly. Back outside, he measured each stake location with his tape recording distances onto graph paper. The measurements formed a crooked line inconsistent with any known survey record. He was walking the final arc when a white SUV pulled up. It rolled to a careful stop beside the fence line, and both Maynard sisters stepped out dressed like they were headed to brunch, not a muddy roadside. "Morning, Mr. Whitaker." Cheryl called, voice artificially bright. "Didn't expect company," George said, not moving from his spot. "We're just prepping for seasonal alignment markers," Cheryl explained. "A small visual guide for the upcoming Pumpkin Path experience. Keeps the trail festive." George stared. "No such term exists in Texas code." Diane gave a slight smile, eyes darting between the stakes. Cheryl tilted her head, the smile hardening at the corners. "Well, it will soon." George didn't reply. Cheryl continued. "There's a long-standing understanding of communal right-of-way here, and we're just building on that legacy. You know, historic cross-property customs, regional flow, community synergy." George raised an eyebrow. "Sounds like words you made up this morning." She opened her mouth but closed it again. "We'll be back with more signage soon," Diane said softly before climbing into the passenger seat. As they pulled away, the SUV's tires left wet curls of mud behind them. George stared at the vanishing dust until it settled, then returned to the shed. That evening, the light slipped early behind a bank of clouds. George adjusted the wildlife camera near the bend, angling it low and steady toward the road. A blinking red dot confirmed it was live. He walked back toward the house, pausing once to scan the horizon. Inside, he removed his boots, poured a small scotch, and sat at the kitchen phone. He dialed Janelle, but it rang into voicemail. "Hey, Pumpkin. Just wanted to check in. Might not make it to Thanksgiving dinner if this keeps up. Love you." The next morning, dew still clinging to the grass, George sat at his kitchen table with toast coffee and the camera's SD card. He loaded it onto his old laptop, watching the grainy infrared footage scroll past. At 2:14 a.m., a pickup truck appeared, lights off bed, loaded with gravel. It idled, then backed toward the bend and dumped its load in a slow, silent spill. There were no plates visible, but on the tailgate, faint and unmistakable, was a rectangular decal, HDC. "You don't fight folks like that with fists," Janelle said, flipping through George's photos. "You fight them with code sections and deadlines." Her voice was steady, not unkind, but clipped with the rhythm of someone used to giving orders in tight spaces. George watched her eyes scan the GPS notations, the stake tags, the grid he'd drawn on graph paper in sharp pencil lines. She wore a navy blazer over a faded ROTC t-shirt and sipped burnt coffee from a chipped courthouse mug. A corner of her desk bore a jar of lemon drops half empty. George's manila folder lay open on the table between them, its tab labeled in black marker W.R. Whitaker. Deed and Easement, 1976. He'd found it tucked behind his late wife's old cornbread cookbook, exactly where she'd said he'd someday need it. Today had become that day. Outside, her Buick sat angled awkwardly on the curb, its antenna bent slightly backward as though winded from one too many courthouse runs. Inside, the smell of toner and paper mingled with the faint lavender of her cardigan. This overlay, she said, pointing to the GIS printout, doesn't have a date-stamped hearing record. And these stakes are within 10 feet of your drainage line. That's regulated. She tapped the edge of the page. This is trespass. You've got the law. George gave a quiet nod. Didn't think I'd be dusting off Dad's notes for anything but nostalgia. Janelle smirked. Nostalgia doesn't usually come with fluorescent plastic and public nuisance. By that afternoon, they'd filed the cease and desist. Janelle had printed 3 copies, all signed and notarized. One went by registered mail to the HDC's listed P.O. box, another to the town clerk. The third she handed to George. "You keep this on you," she said, "and don't talk to them without me from here on." Back in Brindle Hollow, the fall air had turned sharp. George parked by Witt's Diner, the envelope tucked neatly in his inside coat pocket. Franklin was already inside, seated in their usual booth. "Big day?" Franklin asked, sliding over a copy of the Brindle Ledger. The front page bore a headline in cheerful cursive. Local resident opposes community spirit trail, beneath it a photo of Cheryl Maynard gesturing at the road like a proud tour guide. "Seems you're a villain now," Franklin said with a grin. George took the paper, folded it once, and set it aside, then picked up his fork. "Eggs'll get cold. Lemon pie. Later," Franklin added, tapping the takeout box beside him. Edith baked. George gave the smallest smile. "Tell her thanks." Later back home, he adjusted the tripod beside his mailbox. The old Nikon clicked as it captured the stretch of road from the same angle he'd used when photographing the barn's rebuild years ago. He wrote the date and time on a clipboard just beneath yesterday's entry. As dusk came on, the air thickened with the smell of wet leaves and something else pine. He stepped out onto the porch and saw them 4 wooden signposts and a cluster of solar string lights dumped unceremoniously by the roadside. A laminated sign, unreadable from where he stood, flapped in the breeze like a flag planted by intruders. He didn't touch them. Instead, he checked the battery on the trail camera and added another line to his log. Unauthorized beautification materials dropped. 5:42 p.m. Inside, the landline rang. George Janelle's voice crackled faintly. Counties responding slow. "If they pave so much as a foot, you call that tow truck, you hear me?" The next morning, George planted a stake of his own, this time a sign hand-lettered in firm red paint, "Private Road." Entry by permission only. He set it deep, angling the board so no one coming down the curve could miss it. The autumn wind tugged at the corners of his flannel shirt and rustled through the dry grass lining the ditch. With each hammer strike, the post groaned but held steady. When he stepped back to admire the placement, the sun broke briefly through the clouds, casting a faint golden edge along the brush. Franklin arrived just as George tamped down the last of the earth. "They'll twist this in the bulletin, you know, that George didn't look away. Let them try." He dusted off his gloves and headed to the porch where the trail camera still blinked patiently from its perch. Inside, he transferred the latest footage, cataloged the entries, and logged the morning's timestamp with careful precision. It didn't take long. By late morning, the familiar white SUV appeared again, its approach kicking up small clouds of dust. Cheryl was behind the wheel, sunglasses perched high like a battle helmet. Diane sat beside her, visibly tense. George didn't move from his chair. He watched as the SUV paused, then rolled forward, deliberately crossing the boundary of the sign with slow confidence. The red letters reflected in the bumper as the vehicle eased down the road tires, flattening the freshly disturbed gravel. He picked up the phone. "Pete, I need you." Pete, from Elm County Towing, didn't ask many questions. By the time his rust-speckled tow truck rumbled onto the scene, a few local teens had wandered over phones already recording. One boy climbed onto a hay bale across the fence, filming in wide shot like a budding documentarian. Cheryl was out of the car now, pacing in tight, dramatic circles. "This is absurd," she declared. "This road belongs to the spirit of the community." Diane tugged at her sleeve. "Cheryl." "Maybe—" "No," Cheryl snapped. "This man is trying to gatekeep goodwill." George stood quietly, registered deed and cease and desist copy in hand. Janelle had prepped everything stapled and highlighted. Pete, expression unreadable beneath his cap, read the paperwork once, then walked to the SUV. "Ma'am, I need the keys." "You're towing a community vehicle," Cheryl barked. "No, ma'am," Pete said. "I'm towing a trespasser." Diane handed over the keys without another word. The whine of the winch cut through the roadside stillness. The crowd had grown a few couples from the diner, an off-duty postal worker, and old Mrs. Lansing, who stood with her walker beside the mailbox, blinking slowly as if unsure whether she'd wandered into a play. As the SUV lifted, someone cheered. One of the teens muttered, "This is going straight to Brindle Hollow chatter." George didn't smile, but Franklin did. Not bad for a Thursday. Back at Witt's Diner, the TV above the counter played local footage, grainy security cam angles pieced together with a headline that read, "Landowner pushes back tows, Spirit Trail." Vehicle. George stirred his coffee unmoved. He set a lemon slice beside the mug, thinking absently of his late wife's habit of adding one to her tea. Later that evening, as he sorted mail on the porch, he found a plain white envelope, no return address, typed label. Inside was a single line. "Not all of us are asleep. We stand by you." He turned the paper over. Blank. No signature. The landline rang just as he was pinning the note to the refrigerator. George Edith's voice trembled slightly. "I have something you should see, but not here." Click. He stood in the hallway a moment longer, then looked toward the answering machine, blinking in red. One new message. He pressed play. "Hey, Dad, it's me. We've been talking. We might drive down for Thanksgiving after all. Thought maybe you could use some company." Edith Stone hadn't stepped inside the old post office in 20 years. Now she was unlocking the door with trembling hands. The key slipped twice before catching with a soft click. The door gave a reluctant groan as it opened, revealing the dim interior where dust motes hung thick like memory. Wooden benches, long abandoned, lined the walls. A faded bulletin board still held yellowing flyers. Lost Cat Yard Sale. 2003. Community Choir needs tenors. The air smelled faintly of cedar and brittle paper. Edith stood in the doorway for a long moment before stepping inside. "I told Cheryl this place should have never been shut down," she whispered. "But she said it wasn't my place. Funny thing is, I remember when this town believed in fairness." George waited patiently near the sorting counter, hands folded, hat in hand. He said nothing, only gave a small nod as she approached. She opened her oversized handbag with shaking fingers and pulled out a manila folder. Inside were printed emails, dozens of them, some with official HDC headers, others forwarded between personal addresses. The paper trembled slightly in her grip. "I printed them all," she said. "I knew it was wrong, but I didn't know how wrong until they started talking about your road like it was already theirs." George took the folder gently. One email, dated 2 months earlier, stood out in bold font. "If we don't reroute through that farm path, we lose the community garden expansion and matching grant. Make the overlay happen. He's just one man." Another from Cheryl to Diane: redirect funds from decorative signage pool. Use heritage beautification as umbrella. Less scrutiny. George exhaled slowly, eyes scanning line by line. At the house, Janelle leaned over the kitchen table, reading through the stack in stone-faced silence. The old lamp above flickered once before settling. The dog-eared corners of George's deed rested beside her elbow next to a flash drive containing the motion sensor footage and photos of the stake locations. "This is a civil violation," Janelle said finally. "Maybe even criminal." She began assembling a packet cover letter photos printed GIS overlays the emails. She placed each item into a priority envelope with deliberate care, sealing the flap with a firm press of her palm. "You'll need to sign an affidavit," she added. "Summary of your side." George nodded. He sat at the table with a yellow pad and pen, handwriting each line slowly. His script was firm but slightly uneven, a faint tremor he hadn't had before. At the bottom he signed, paused, and added the date. "I'll notarize this tomorrow morning," he said. Edith stood at the edge of the kitchen holding her coat in both hands like a shield. "I don't know if my family's going to talk to me after this," she said, "but if you've got leftover pie at Thanksgiving—" George looked up. "You're always welcome." The next morning, beneath a sky hung with pewter clouds, George walked to the post office again. The rain had started light and steady, tapping gently on his shoulders. Janelle met him on the steps, her umbrella too small for both of them. They entered together. The clerk at the front desk, a younger woman George didn't recognize, notarized the affidavit with a practiced flourish, then slid the final envelope into the outgoing bin marked County Auditor. Priority. George and Janelle stepped outside. They didn't speak. Just stood in the quiet for a moment, watching the rain trail off the mailbox lid. The next day, as he came back from the shed, George spotted a new sign staked near his driveway. Bright white, plastic-coated. Official. Pending county review. Property freeze in effect. He stared at it for a long time, then turned and went inside. The town hall smelled of coffee and old carpet, but the tension in the air was fresh and flammable. Brindle Hollow hadn't seen this kind of turnout since the bicentennial potluck back in '96. Folding chairs filled every row, some double-occupied by coats still damp from the steady morning rain. The low hum of whispered conversations was broken only by the click of camera shutters and the soft shuffle of documents being arranged at the front. George sat quietly near the center aisle, hands folded thumb, brushing the sleeve of his old brown jacket, the one he wore the day he and his father signed the land deed under a pecan tree years and decades gone. "Still mine," he whispered, then adjusted his cuff and looked toward the dais. Janelle stood already addressing the room with the calm cadence of someone who didn't need theatrics to be heard. "Our packet includes notarized documents, time-stamped footage, GIS overlays, and internal emails provided by a former HDC treasurer. The evidence demonstrates clear procedural overreach, unauthorized land use, and deliberate misallocation of beautification funds." She placed each item down with deliberate precision, pausing just enough between pages for the cameras to click. George was called next. He rose slowly, walking past neighbors who a month ago had barely nodded in the diner. Now they made way for him like he was walking through pews in church. He took the podium, voice steady. "This is not about a road. It's about trust and trespass. They didn't ask. They assumed. They built on what they didn't own and hid behind decorations and slogans." He held up the photo of his stake, the red-lettered one that had started it all. "I don't want applause. I just want my name and my father's name to stay where it belongs. On our land." A murmur swept through the hall. Cheryl stood abruptly. "This is petty," she snapped. "This man, he had my car towed, he humiliated our community. That was vindictive, not civic-minded." Her face flushed, a deep red, strands of hair escaping from her usual pristine twist. "I built programs. Trails. Holiday banners. I gave this town identity." Diane stood slowly. "I told her it wasn't right," she said, voice just loud enough to carry. "I didn't want this, but she said no one would stand up to us." Gasps flared across the room like match strikes. The county auditor cleared his throat. "Please, decorum." Edith rose next her, cane tapping softly against the tile. She held a single page and unfolded it with care. "This is an email sent by Cheryl dated October 2nd. It reads, and I quote, 'Even if he's right, it has to go. We can't lose the trail momentum now." She looked up. I believed in her, but belief without integrity is just noise. Cheryl slammed her hand on the table. "You don't get to erase me." The sound echoed sharply. A child in the back row whimpered, quickly hushed by a parent. From the rear, Franklin leaned over to a nearby farmer and muttered, "That's enough noise for one lifetime." The county board recessed briefly. When they returned, the decision was read aloud without flourish. Effective immediately, the Heritage Development Committee is suspended from all activity pending investigation. Ms. Cheryl Maynard is subject to inquiry under County Code 41B. All projects under the Heritage Trail Initiative are to cease. No one cheered. People just sat, letting it sink in. The quiet felt heavier than the storm outside. As the crowd filtered out, George stepped alone past the bulletin board nailed outside the hall. A new flyer, freshly laminated, fluttered slightly in the breeze. Community governance under county oversight until further review. He read the line once then again, and stood quietly beneath it. As the autumn wind rustled the last of the dry leaves along the farm road, Brindle Hollow began to feel a little less silent and a little more seen. George's quiet stand reminded everyone that boundaries once crossed in silence must eventually be redrawn in truth. Power, even when dressed in seasonal garlands and pleasant smiles, still needs watching. When rules are used to protect a town can flourish, but when twisted, they slowly erode the trust that binds neighbors. Maybe it's never too late to speak with kindness, stand with courage, and remind each other where the real road begins.